Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day number 34 of the Bible in 365. Today we're taking a look at Leviticus 11:9 through 13:39. You all know the drill. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, folks, so our discussion ended yesterday on Leviticus chapter 11. Within this chapter, we began discussing how it outlines the animals that are determined clean and unclean for the Israelites, both for consumption and their interactions, whether or not they can touch these animals. We discussed with regards to land animals, and so two of the requirements were that animals, in order for them to be deemed clean, they had to be hooved and they had to chew the cud. So there were certain animals, like camels, that were exempt. They couldn't touch these or eat these animals, so like pigs and camels. Moving forward with this discussion, chapter 11 then breaks down for us the clean and unclean sea creatures. And essentially here it tells us that any of the creatures that have scales and fins are considered clean, but those without these fins and scales were considered unclean for consumption and for offerings. So these had to be avoided. Now, it also gives the Israelites some rules regarding other types of creatures. So regarding birds, regarding creatures that swarm, creatures that fly. And essentially, the whole concept of this is chapter 11 is talking about cleanliness and this idea of preventing disease from spreading. And so essentially, unclean things contaminate clean things and they make them unfit before the Lord. Now, at the end of the chapter, it does discuss several instructions on handling unclean things. Most of the time, you had to avoid unclean things and touching them. You couldn't touch the carcass of an unclean animal. You definitely couldn't eat an unclean animal. And God offered rules on what to do if a person ate an unclean animal. So they would have to essentially wash their clothes and they would remain unclean until the sun fell. All right, folks, moving forward to chapter 12. So in Leviticus chapter 12, essentially it gives us details regarding the ceremonial cleanliness of women after they have given birth. And we see that their uncleanliness is determined based upon the sex of the baby. So if they give birth to a baby boy, they have to wait 7 days and are unclean for 7 days. And then this essentially means they can't set foot in the ceremony and participate in holy rituals. But on the 8th day, which was the same day that the baby boy was circumcised, the mother then can essentially go into a period of waiting, which lasted approximately 33 days until her bleeding stops. And until that point, she couldn't go into the temple. She was forbidden and she couldn't touch anything holy. Now, if a woman gave birth to a baby girl, then essentially she had to wait twice as long. She had to wait 14 days and was still forbidden to enter into the temple and for a period of time. So once she goes through this purification period, the woman then would have to bring forth 2 offerings to the tent of meeting, a 1-year-old lamb and a pigeon or a dove, and it was supposed to be a sacrifice that was given by the priest, and these were sin offerings that would make an atonement for the woman or the mother. Now, once these offerings were made, she could go back and worship as usual. All right, folks, moving forward to chapter 13. Chapter 13 discusses the laws that God has for the Israelites concerning skin disease. A lot of people think specifically just leprosy, but almost any type of skin disease. And so essentially it determines whether or not a person is unclean or not. So at the beginning of the chapter, it tells us these different scenarios of what do you do if you suspect that someone has a skin disease or has leprosy. So essentially they would come before Moses and Aaron. And initially, if a person has some sort of skin rashes or bright spots that could be leprosy or a skin disease, they were quarantined for 7 days so that Aaron or his sons could determine what the problem was. And then, essentially, if a person had leprosy, they would have to essentially determine whether or not it was spreading. So they have to kind of classify what stage of a skin disease this person has. And so sometimes they would be held for 7 days and then another 7 days, or sometimes they were only held for 7 days and then released. So it gives these specific details for each case on what to do so that people aren't infecting others or aren't spreading disease across Israelites. Now, ultimately, it is here on this discussion of cleanliness and ceremonial cleanliness, what deems you to be clean and unclean, especially with regards to skin diseases, rashes, bright spots, that we end our discussion for tonight. Our discussion will pick back up tomorrow as we take a look at Leviticus chapter 13, beginning in verse 40, and we're going to be exploring all the way to Leviticus chapter 14, ending in verse 57. All right, folks, as always, God bless.